to Life of Die, the podcast which discusses all things role-playing and wargame related. To coincide with the release of Cyberpunk 2077 on gaming consoles and PCs, we thought we'd have a look at the inspiration for that game, the pen and paper role-playing game Cyberpunk. I'm going to be joined in this podcast by Bob and Craig, who have varying degrees of experience on Cyberpunk. We'll start with Craig. What's your background with Cyberpunk?
Yeah, so Cyberpunk for me was probably just movies in the kind of early 90s, probably a little bit too young, but getting into things like Akira and the Verhoeven movies, and then later on Johnny Mnemonic, Strange Days, that kind of those kind of movies, and then later on with The Matrix as well. So yeah, I kind of grew up with Cyberpunk as an aesthetic. Again, my older brother was quite into all that sort of stuff as well. So it's always been something I've kind of gravitated towards. And then later on, getting into a career in IT, doing it for real, and obviously just the world as it is at the moment is starting to get a bit cyberpunk. So yeah, that's my kind of grounding in it. In terms of games, RPGs, I think, Deus Ex on the PC was a big one for me. That leaned heavily on cyberpunk tropes. It was an RPG as well, so it gave you a little bit of experience of that world. I absolutely loved that game. Played through it multiple times. And then, in terms of the tabletop, Cyberpunk 2020 was my introduction to pen and paper role-playing games, GM5 for Self Gordon, and it was great to kind of let loose in a fully realised retro future cyberpunk Glasgow. It was great fun, and then I was really looking forward to the Cyberpunk 2077 game. It's been obviously on the cards for many years now, and I've been following it closely. And then the big release happened, and it's obviously not been as well received as we'd all hoped. But I hadn't yet upgraded to a new console or a new PC to run it yet, so I'm quite glad I kind of kept my cards close to my chest there. But yeah, that's probably me.
And what about yourself, Bob? What's your background with Cyberpunk?
Similar to Craig. I think probably the earliest cyberpunk thing I can think of just off the top of my head would be Blade Runner, which I had actually seen at quite a young age because it was one of my dad's favourite films. So that was the first thing, and I really liked that film. It was prominent in video games as well. System Shock 2 is the first one I can think of, which was it leaned heavily on the kind of augmented sort of person kind of idea, like the RPG elements in that. It was mainly kind of upgrading cybernetic implants that your character had. I can't remember now. I think there were skills and things as well, but the actual augments were a big part of that game. And that was it was one of my favourites when I was younger. So, and it kind of touched on some of the other things about corporations as well, but which also leads me on to kind of round about the same sort of time. I really liked the RoboCop films as well, which is based on changing a man into a machine, and it's got motifs of like this all powerful corporation and things. So it was something that I kind of grew up with. Like Craig says, later on you had things like The Matrix, and I do remember Johnny Mnemonic as well. I quite liked that film. Basically a guy with a flash drive in his head. And round about the year 2000, I think I would have been about 12 or something. I think that's when Deus Ex came out. It was a whole series of those games, but like Craig, I played those through multiple times, and it was similar. It leaned on things from System Shock, like augments that your character had, as well as skills and things that could be developed, and other RPG elements, and it made it interesting to play through multiple times because there was different ways to approach the situation. Like I said, there was a whole series of those games right up until about 2016 for the PC anyway, which I played even up until this year. I've replayed some of them. And I think it was maybe about a bit over a year ago. I think it was probably 2018. I actually ran the Cyberpunk 2020 paper and pen RPG as a kind of homebrew campaign. I think we did about 12 installments for that.
Yeah, that was a big deal because that was the first time you'd went into GMing. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that was the first game that I kind of that I ran. Even wasn't actually using the source material. It was just a kind of my own concoction. And I hadn't actually played the paper and pen RPG myself, but it was obviously I felt like the material was somewhat familiar because all these things in culture, that you've grown up with, it's you have your own kind of mixture of it from the things that you liked when you were growing up.
Yeah, one of the things I think is really good about the cyberpunk genre is that when you grew up with those kind of the science fiction action films of the 80s, there was a lot of sources of inspiration, if you like, for your campaign, because so many things are touchstones to the genre. Blade Runner, I would agree, is the key one, which really set it all up. I mean, I've always imagined the cities in Cyberpunk to be the Los Angeles in Blade Runner. That kind of look always reigning. And then you did, as Craig mentioned, you get Akira, which was another great cyberpunk film. There's also Ghost in the Shell is another one, but there was, as well as Johnny Mnemonic and Strange Days. I'd seen both of those and liked those both, but The Matrix seemed to be the one that really kicked it out into the mainstream. I think up until then it was a fairly select science fiction crowd that were into these things, but suddenly The Matrix was like a massive film, massive success. In the late 90s, I think that was about 98, The Matrix came out.
Yeah.
And so one of the strong points of the cyberpunk game is that you could use elements from all these different great films and make it your own. So I can understand the attraction to you to make that your first game that you were going to run.
Yeah, well, thinking on just what you were saying there, even things like the Alien franchise had elements of cyberpunk in it, with the large kind of corporations kind of that had overtaken everything, and I think there's kind of fan suggestion that was in the same universe as Blade Runner. Whether that's the case or not doesn't matter, but it's like you're saying. I think even though I hadn't played that game myself, Cyberpunk 2020, I kind of ended up. I felt quite an easy game to run because there's so many different films and games and things over the years that have elements from that. And I think mine ended up being some kind of it was like a world that was based on elements from all of those kind of things. And it was an interesting game to run, certainly, even though there's interesting elements, but from a story perspective, it was it felt like quite a rewarding one to do.
No, definitely. I mean, I found that myself when I've run Cyberpunk over the years. I'd run it with a group quite a bit. Well, in fact, early '90s. I ran a group. The version of Cyberpunk that we're all talking about, by the way, tonight is the second edition Cyberpunk, which is 2020, and yeah, I had that. I ran that in, I think about 93, 94, I think it was. I ran that for about 12 weeks or so, and yeah, I mean, the game seemed really futuristic, and yeah, it was only the last, when I've been thinking about doing this podcast the last few days, I realised how much the world had kind of caught up a bit with Cyberpunk, and like Craig said, it feels like society's becoming more and more cyberpunk all the time. Yeah, but
yeah, well, the interesting thing about that's there's all this going on with like digital currency now, not cryptocurrency, and the kind of issues with like cyber attacks, like people's data getting hacked and all this kind of thing. Like, it's, like you say, it's like cyberpunk coming into real life almost.
Yeah, and this surveillance surveillance society that we've got as well a bit now. Sorry, Craig, what were you going to say?
No, I was watching something on the news a while back about the kind of conflict in Syria and things, and a lot of the big oil companies out there are now hiring kind of PMCs themselves to kind of look after their assets. And you've actually got private military forces hired by big oil industry giants to defend their assets, and they're fighting against kind of sovereign troops of a different country, and it's just it's a whole thing that's obviously played out in a lot of the kind of cyberpunk tropes as well.
No. Yeah, it's like literal kind of corporate warfare.
Definitely, that's and the idea then, I think, is, well, it probably always was the case that the likes of the oil companies probably had more money than some governments did, but the fact that there's so many huge corporations, the Apples and the Amazons of the world that now are bigger than America even, in terms of their assets, the amount of money that they have. It's went to another scale. So yeah, I suppose that's one of the downsides of globalization, that some companies have got a bit too much power now, you could argue. No doubt I'll get the corporations coming after me for saying stuff like that, but anyway, just to give you my own background with Cyberpunk, again, I'm technically a child of the 70s, but I grew up in the 80s and saw all the same kind of films and had the same interest in all those films, and yeah, and as I said, in the early 90s I started running Cyberpunk and had a lot of fun with that, particularly when one of the players was really engaged with the setting and started telling me what his character was up to in between sessions. So I kind of ran it almost like each session was a week apart, almost in real time, with this future world. And so he would tell me what would have happened in that week and what he was up to, his nefarious deeds. And one of the things that was really interesting about that, and it kind of changed my philosophy a lot and how I was doing role playing. Up until then, I think role playing was just, you interacted with what was there and the thing in front of you. Most of my experience at that point had been playing Judge Dredd, so it was, you were looking at it from an investigation, so it was more about solving the crime and things like that. And then I did a bit of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but again, it was kind of dip in and out play. But yeah, the way that he did that in that particular campaign meant going forward, when I started, when I get the chance to play role-playing games, I was definitely engaging a lot more heavily with the setting and with the game master, and trying to give the character that depth that they were thinking there was stuff going on out with the game, and that's carried through. Well, obviously when you ran Cyberpunk again for me, Bob, when I was playing your game, I think I did carry that kind of thing, that ethos into it, and kept the character was always up to stuff. from memory in the background.
Yeah, your character was really involved in the story, and I think the thing I liked about Cyberpunk was what you said, that it was because it was easy to draw on all these different familiar elements from media that you've consumed throughout your life. It felt like it was, for me anyway, it felt like quite easy to make quite a rich kind of environment for you guys to go around in. And obviously you added to that quite a lot by sort of putting in backstory of what your character was doing in between sessions and what his motivations were and things like that. And it kind of I felt like it helped us build up quite a cyberpunk world.
No, definitely. It was a lot of fun doing that. But yeah, so that one player kind of changed my ethos about role playing. And I did it again in Alien as well. We played that quite recently, the Free League RPG, and that all came out eventually in the wash, and I was trying. Craig's character was getting blamed for things, but yeah, we'll not get into that now. When we talk about that in the Alien podcast, that we'll plan to do in the future as well. So I suppose one question would be then, what do you? It's a question that's a bit controversial amongst the cyberpunk community and Facebook, it seems anyway. What do you deem to be cyberpunk? Because a lot of people don't know what the term actually means. What would you say the main things were that they made something cyberpunk? We'll start with you, Craig.
Yeah, so it is a hard one, and I get the contention around it. I think it's that kind of like pioneering, living on the edge type element, rather than being a kind of glossy vision of the future. It tends to be people making their way in the world as best they can, and just kind of, I don't know, kind of fighting with the elements around them. I think that for me kind of makes it more cyberpunk than simply being a glossy sci-fi look at the future. Obviously the elements of things like dealing with augmentation and what it is to be human and all those kind of things come into it as well.
Yeah, the technology is definitely a big part of what makes cyberpunk. I think that the fact that you can essentially augment your character, the physical being, in all sorts of different ways with different technologies. Yeah, we'll come on to that in a minute as well. Talk about some of those technologies. But yeah, I agree with all that, and I would add that the things about the corporations as well that Bob had alluded to there. That whole thing where the corporates own everybody, they own the city, they own everything, and yeah, I agree with you that everybody else is down at the bottom and trying to simply survive all of this. Yeah, it's definitely gritty and kind of horrifying. I'd definitely say that about it. What about you, Bob? Is there anything else that you would add to that?
I think for me, like, cyberpunk as a genre has like a few kind of core elements, and depending on the film or the book or the game, sometimes they explore other things as well. But the core things is that it's generally like a dystopian kind of setting that's in the future with like high technology, corporate corruption. It's got a kind of stylistic element that, in film and stuff, it's normally dark, it's raining, and there's like neon signs and all this kind. It has like a style of its own. And the technology side, it's usually like high-tech computers or augmentation, as you say. So for me, they're kind of some of the core sort of things of that style.
Yeah, you'd expect to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, while we're talking, since we're moving on to technologies, I thought I'd run through some of the vast number of technologies that there are in Cyberpunk. So you get fashion wear, which is technologies which are, you can have like glowing tattoos on your body, or perhaps strands of hair which have been implanted, which can glow different colours and so on like that. But there's also more functional technologies such as a biomonitor, which is implanted in the forearm, and it monitors your pulse, temperature, your blood sugar, which made me laugh when I read that description again. It sounds like a Fitbit.
Coming back to that, like a Fitbit, and also the hair implants and stuff. Like, you've obviously got that kind of alt culture in real life, and people can have like implants, like piercings and things, but implants, and all. But also on the tech side of it, like you've got Elon Musk working on Neuralink, which is, he describes that as a Fitbit in your head. But yeah, but then there's also like medical augmentations, like people have in real life for like lost limbs, or like hearing problems and things like that. So I feel like there is some real life applications there.
I remember going way back to the kind of early 90s. I think it was one of the professors at the University of Reading was one of the first people to become cybernetically enhanced officially, because he got the RFID chip implanted in his arm that opened all the doors in the university, so he could just walk around and kind of wave his hand over the doors. That was one of the first ones, but it's been coming up for 30 years ago now, maybe.
Yeah, I've heard of a lot of people doing that kind of thing. There was a TV program on about it a couple of years ago. A bunch of people that had done that type of thing, but it's does seem to be happening more and more.
Yeah, the implants are another thing that's in another technology in the game, where you can have gills implanted to let you breathe water. There's a organ that you can have which essentially creates more oxygen, and it lets you hold your breath for a long time. There's even like a pocket under the skin, so you can stash hidden items into your body, which reminds me a bit of a film called Videodrome. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's a David Cronenberg film which had weird stuff like that going on in it. So yeah, the implants side is really interesting and a bit disturbing. You've also got BioWare in Cyberpunk, which is like kind of muscle literally grafted onto your body to make it stronger. There's skin weaves which toughen the top layers of the skin, giving you kind of armour. You can even have nanobots surgically healing you from inside, microscopic nanobots. And as Craig alluded to earlier on, you can also have some cyber weapons grafted onto your body, and you can get like big knucks, which are like knuckle dusters that are permanently surgically implanted on your knuckles, obviously. And yeah, Craig, your character had the Wolvers, which are essentially Wolverine's the kind of blades that he's got in his fist. Yeah, which I agreed that was always a kind of cool and craftily stolen idea for Cyberpunk. There was also sorry, on you go.
For augmentations, would you get one in real life?
No, I don't think I would. I think I'm too old for all that kind of stuff. I think I'm too old school in a lot of different things. That's why I still run paper and pen RPGs. I have went through periods where I played a lot of video games as well, but to me there's something about, as good as an immersive as the computer games are, there is something about dealing face to face with people, or as more recently we've had to doing it over the internet. But there is something about role playing games that's just still to me better than playing a computer game online, even when you've got online options to have other people in your team. You just don't have that. Nobody really does the role playing aspect, if that makes sense. Everybody kind of essentially just controls their characters and has general chat. It doesn't do that. It doesn't. They don't really get into the whole thing of this is who my character is and all that. I think it could work actually. Now that I think about it, that you could do that. But I suppose part of the thing against it is that when you're playing a computer game, there's a lot more. Everything's quite frantic in a computer game, whereas in a role playing game you can really slow down the combat and allow yourself time to think about what it is that you're doing and being able to. I think in a computer game when the action's non-stop, it's very hard to role play because you're trying to concentrate on blowing the thing up in front of you or whatever it is, shoot whatever it is. Whereas in the RPG, there are a lot more opportunities for role playing because the GM rightly won't always be doing action. It will be interactions with NPCs where you're trying to find out information or whatever it is. You buy trading with people, all sorts of different kind of social interactions that probably wouldn't feature in a video game, and if they did, you probably wouldn't enjoy it that much because you're only interacting with a programmed response, I suppose. So
you're right. Yeah, it's not the same, kind of. You don't get the same interaction with characters in a video game, a single player, and if it's online, there are options for that kind of role playing, but it is all in real time, and you're always going to have, people playing the game their own way. So it's not the same as kind of exploring like a world where everyone's, like a paper and pen game where everyone's agreeing that they're going to play a character and kind of keep to character like most of the time. If you're playing online, you might have someone running around like trolling people or something. Or
I think there's room for that in pen and paper RPG as well, though, to be fair. I think especially with Cyberpunk 2020, with the kind of massive amount of kind of character customization you can do, and you can sync all your character points, etc., into being a kind of human weapon, or you can just do it all in being a member of a band and just spend it all on tattoos and hair implants. And I guess the two of those types of people might not necessarily gel in a group, or when it comes to things like combat or whatever else. But I guess if they're playing it on their own way and it works, then it's all good.
I think it's actually quite a good thing sometimes to have a mix of different styles in a group. It does mean that potentially they'll pull in different ways, but I do think generally speaking, if everybody's different interests in terms of what they want to do with their character, then they tend to work better as a cohesive whole, because the ones that are good at the solos essentially will dominate the combat, I suppose, in Cyberpunk 2020. Sorry, we will get into the different roles and so on in a follow-up podcast. Whereas the fixers, they're kind of streetwise kind of dealers of information. They can then come in and find out information which is relevant to the plot, and where the techies can develop and fix new equipment. All these different characters should be able to complement each other in a session. So I don't think it's. I suppose the biggest tensions come if you've got players that want to be more. What's the word I'm looking for? Kind of slightly more hesitant in getting into trouble and things, or if you've got somebody that's just like a tank basically that wants to go in and fight everything. Yeah. Then I think at that stage, then you probably will start getting some tensions within the group because of it.
Bring us back to the implants and what's available. I think Bob was actually originally asking, would you get one in real life?
Yeah, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't,
because I think I'm so old-fashioned. I don't. I find technology in general quite frustrating, to be perfectly honest. Anytime technology is in my life, eventually ends up with Control Alt Delete at some point, and I just don't have the patience for it, and I don't like it particularly.
You do seem particularly cursed with it. In fairness, it could be maybe best avoided it. You have to reboot your arm every morning or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what happens when you can't get the software update? That's the other thing that worries me. You know, if you don't have the money to do it, does it become obsolete like every other computer that's out there? It lasts for so many years, and then it's okay. You need something.
I think that's another element of it as well, which has been played on in quite a few kind of cyberpunk movies and the likes, is the idea that you side with a particular corporation's wetware or implants, and then that gives them a degree of control over you because they've got some sort of kill switch, or they've got an ability to gather all your information or control you or whatever. So yeah. I think we're already quite close to that as it is with the virtual assistants and Fitbits and everything.
I mean, would you two, how would you feel about that kind of stuff yourselves?
Depends what it is. I wouldn't go risking my life for a glowing tattoo, but I don't know, maybe some rovers. I think that would be handy.
You might get those. I don't know. It depends what it is. It's funny how you're talking about the kind of selling your data and all that kind of stuff. Like that, we're all kind of doing that already with mobile phones.
And social media as well. We're all handing over our personal information, and everybody's following us through cookies.
I think it's naive. There's people out there that still don't quite get how economics work. That Google and Microsoft and Apple and whoever else aren't giving you all this unlimited storage on their platforms, on the likes of YouTube or whatever, for free. It's not for free. It's costing them an absolute fortune to store all that data. You get it for free because they gain so much from that transaction in terms of marketing and just kind of knowledge about you. And you can then sell on. It's
like tailored advertising data, isn't it?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Because you have something we've not touched on is I think nowadays you have like a digital self, which is like the culmination of your emails, your browsing behaviour, all the marketing stuff that you've agreed to.
Which is kind of less cool than it was sold to us. I think again in lots of cyberpunk media that's played with as well. That you've got this avatar on the net, or you've got this avatar in the cyberspace, but it's generally like a cool version of you that can do all these wonderful things. Whereas in actual fact, your digital avatar is just your credit score and your mother's maiden name and all that kind of stuff, which is probably less sexy.
Yeah, but also what they can best sell to you and when.
Yeah,
that's kind of, to me, that's like what your digital self is. It's like the culmination of your behaviours from like a sales point of view, which that can then be sold to whatever companies could best meet your needs, as well as pay for whatever, Google or Microsoft's, give them a cut of the revenue for basically, it's like almost targeting the specific ads that are personal to you, and specifically in Europe, I think it's actually changed the internet for the worse, because you'll notice every web page you go to, you've got like GDPR permissions pop-ups coming up saying, "Can we use your data?" And if you've probably just clicked agree, but if you've ever clicked the other button, which usually it's not always called the same thing,
a lot,
it gives you like a massive list of like things that if you don't want it, you have uncheck it all.
It's a thing that I'm quite kind of glad of it, to be honest, because it does give you a bit of a reminder now and again that about what you are giving up when you sign up to a new website, or even when you visit a new website, that kind of thing. It's good that I think it's kind of good that, although it's annoying to get the pop-ups, I think it's kind of good to ground yourself a little bit and remind yourself of what you give up when you take the easy route of going to one of the big corporations.
Yeah, so being owned by a corporation is definitely a present thread that's a cyberpunk theme, definitely. Just getting back to the actual technology of the game, there's also cyber optics, which are eye implants, and you can get infrared vision. Thermograph's a bit like predator vision, and you can also, if you get smart gun links where you link your body up to a physical weapon, you can get targeting scopes, and you can get scrolling text coming down over your eyes telling you what's happening in the world, kind of data coming up in your eye. And I always liked that idea. I always thought that was a really cool idea. And we're getting slightly closer to that. Was it Google get some kind of glasses or something like that do something like that, where they bring up data or something, put overlays over your vision?
Yeah, it was a while back. It worked really well as well. It was a pretty decent product, but they canned it. I think basically the world wasn't quite ready for it yet.
Right.
Google Glass, that was called.
Yeah.
It's really just an experimental thing. They released it for a kind of public beta. It was just toying.
Yeah, I saw quite a few folk with it on in Glasgow and stuff. But yeah, I think it's just one of those ones that the technology worked, as well as you could expected. But there's just so many, when you think about the legalities of it all, if you're allowed to walk into a cinema wearing them, or not even driving with them, that kind of thing, there was just so much to it to be ironed out that they more or less parked it. But I think it will come back around again.
Yeah, eventually we'll do it.
I think it's seen more kind of enterprise and professional applications at the moment.
Yeah, so they've now kind of moved on to augmented reality using things like smart glass or whatever, which is projecting virtual 3D elements into the world in front of you.
Yep.
That's been used a lot by the military and architecture and everything, and then obviously coming back to gaming. I think they talk about that being one of the future of tabletop gaming, that you'll, rather than going to Games Workshop and buying a box of Space Marines and taking them home and cutting them out of sprues and painting them up, you'll just buy a kind of download pack, and then they'll just appear in front of you. You can still, physically move them around in front of you, but
I'll save a lot of storage, that's for sure.
yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of okay with it, but I think at some point you just have to think, what's the point? Why would I not just play it on the computer?
Yeah,
I think even a lot of board games now contain an element where it requires an iPad or requires some kind of augmented reality. I think the XCOM game that came out recently has that. Things like some things for the better. A lot of the Fantasy Flight games like Manchester Madness, Imperial Assault use an app on the iPad to allow you to effectively have the Dungeon Master controlled by an AI or whatever, which frees up a player slot for someone to be on the playing team, which is great, or even allows you to play solo, which is really good. But I do worry about going down this kind of augmented reality route, or the route where you don't have anything physically in front of you, and it kind of.
Yeah, I don't know how much truth's in it, but I remember hearing a little while ago about a company that was doing like contact lenses that you could wear, and they weren't for like vision correction. It was so that it linked like with your phone, and it would have like augmented reality elements that could appear, in front of you, similar to Google Glass, but like a less kind of obvious. It wouldn't really look like you had anything there.
I think that's one of the I think that is the big stumbling block for it. Isn't the technology? Technology exists for all of this. It's the acceptance in society of knowing that someone sitting across from you in the bus could be filming you or whatever, without your knowledge, which happens a lot as it is with people with mobile phones and things. But even more so if it's just going around their daily lives and everything's recorded. I mean, we've got things like that with dash cams at the moment, which have been great for insurance and. But again, it's just the normalisation of that kind of thing is brings great benefits, but also has a little bit of a sinister side attached to it.
Yeah, I think the positive side I would say from it would be if you were going to things like museums and so on, and if it was like you're walking around and this thing was telling you information about these, like the things that you're looking at. I think in those kind of circumstances, I can see the benefits of it, but I agree that it could be, like all technologies, it can be completely misused.
Yeah, I mean, the trade-off with that is you could be live streaming it to 10,000 people and then that museum loses out on 10,000 visitors. Or, I mean, I think it will be abused, of course.
I think
that's always a problem.
It's funny how we have these kind of cyberpunk elements in real life, like with the phones and stuff, that people don't really think about it because it's like it's happening in the background. Like it's just a phone. Like you could leave it in the house. Like when would you ever leave it in the house? That is kind of the point. But things like Google Glass or something like that, or like the contact lenses or the NFC like implant. Say you had like an NFC implant in your hand to make like Google Pay or whatever. Like I think there is like a barrier there to people accepting that because it's like crossing the line a wee bit. I don't know.
And that's where we're at. We're at the stage now where the technology is surpassing the willingness for society to adopt it, which is potentially the first time it's happened. I mean, it could have always. I guess it's always a bit of a race, but yeah, certainly now the technology exists for many of these things we've seen in sci-fi for a number of years, but the society just isn't ready to adopt them. Automatically driving cars, like the Teslas and stuff, are a prime example of that. I mean, they've been proven to drive themselves autonomously, albeit with some caveats. I think certain British countryside roads leads them to just driving it. Certainly in the wide open highways of the States, etc., they've been proven to drive safely, by themselves, with a much lower kind of accident rate. But again, it's one of these ones that there's so many legal barriers as well as just kind of societal acceptance barriers to it that it's probably not going to become mainstream for a while yet.
It's funny that you mention autonomous driving because I think there's a huge like industrial and economic benefit to that happening, which we live in a capitalist society, a capitalist world practically. So I actually think that the economics might drive that to happen.
Yeah, well, it's obviously it's massive. It's massive this week, particularly for the UK. You've got, if you look at the photos of Kent and Dover at the moment, where you've got tens of thousands of lorries and trucks full of goods stuck in the harbour, or on the way into the harbour side, and you've now effectively got 10,000 delivery drivers having to camp in their trucks, and obviously a lot of them are kitted out for a few days anyway because they expect these sort of things to happen. But yeah, if that was all autonomous, it just wouldn't matter massively. I think for movement of goods and stuff, that has to happen. I'm trying to think. I think the movie that played on that slightly was it Logan, Old Man Logan, the Wolverine movie set in the future. That had a scene in it where all the trucks were effectively cabless kind of carriages on wheels driving down the highway, and they were all autonomous, and there was a bit of a kind of chase scene, diving in amongst them. But it does it does kind of in a similar way to the way that the UK's Victorian or prior to that rail network is kind of collapsing under its own weight and isn't sustainable anymore. I think the road system is similar when it comes to getting goods up and down the country and across countries. If they kind of want to continue to use that, then the only real way to do it with the density they're going to need is to have things driving autonomously at 100 miles an hour, edge to edge, bumper to bumper with one another, and not causing an accident. And again, I think the data has shown that it is safer for the most part if you've got a fleet of fully autonomous vehicles all networked together, all in contact with each other, knowing each other's speeds, knowing each other's braking distances. They can gather kind of crowdsourced data from one another about road conditions and optimal driving and stuff. Whereas at the moment, you could have that and then chuck a 17-year-old a souped-up Corsa in the middle of it and just cause chaos. So I think the sooner the human element's removed from that, the better. And I for one, it's one of those things you might think. What's the technology you look forward to the most? And that's maybe the question I can ask in a second. But what's the technology you look forward to the most that you fear you might miss out on in life? And I guess
jetpacks.
One of those ones is like, jetpacks. Yeah. But you might want to see the cure for cancer or whatever. But for me, I think it's basically the car that can come and pick you up from the pub. You just roll into it and it takes you home, and then that's it. And, never having to get a taxi again, never having to worry about any of that. To me, that just sounds amazing.
But I think part of the reason these things aren't being accepted is because there's that human thing of you don't want to hand control over to a machine. I think there's a rightly or wrongly, there's a perception that the machine can have errors and humans can better deal with, particularly if there's an emergency situation. They can think on their feet and computer algorithms won't cut it. I know that's probably wrong because a computer can think a lot faster than a human can.
I think there's general concern, and AI is a big subject in itself, and I think there is a concern about handing over complete control to machines for risk of a Judgment Day scenario from Terminator or something just less kind of severe but still impactful. I think that there is this inherent mistrust of machines, but like a lump it, there is, in terms of they've got medical artificial intelligences now that can diagnose things much more accurately than humans can. Obviously, they're still fed from data from humans. A lot of this kind of has to start somewhere with a human, but I think handing over complete control is still a bit of a barrier. And again, this is where I was kind of getting at earlier, this idea that it's not the technology that's limiting us anymore. We have it all. It's just the willingness to give up our kind of control.
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
I think the cyberpunk element of that, I think, will drive that in real life, though, is that the corporate profit, like not having to pay like hundreds of thousands of drivers all over the world to work lorries or whatever, or taxi drivers or whatever. Anyone that does that type of job of driving a vehicle, like that could effectively be made completely redundant from an insurance point of view. In the theory, I think you could possibly make, cars that can drive with like an accident rate of like 1% or less, So I think ultimately it seems funny that the kind of corporate profit is something that could drive this to happen in real life.
Yeah, well, I believe we're at that kind of tipping point at the moment. So I think I may have dreamt this. I'll need to verify my facts after this, but I believe that there is haulage happening in the States at the moment completely autonomously. It's either Tesla trucks or similar, but they still do pay a driver to sit there and wake up and take control if something happens, which is a bit of a kind of bizarrity. It's the same as we talked about with planes, like commercial airliners for years, that for the most part the pilots are fairly redundant. They do the takeoff and they do the landing, but it's for the 99% of the time it's controlled by computer or it's guided by computer.
And drones have become a major thing in warfare as well.
Yeah, drones as well, and it's. I think again they talked about it, that they could have made the airline industry a lot more efficient a long time ago. We're talking about the kind of 90s here. If they'd removed the pilot's cabin and got rid of two guys that were probably getting a couple $100,000 between them a year in salary, take them out of the equation and just have it AI controlled. And the technology again exists and it's been proven to work without any issues. But the idea of putting yourself inside an aluminium tin can flown by a robot and sent 30,000 feet into the air, I don't know. Again, I think I'm up for it. I want someone else to go first, though, if that's all right.
I think one of the kind of sub conversation of this would be that inevitably, as things become more and more automated, humans are going to have fewer jobs, and that's definitely another aesthetic we didn't mention about Cyberpunk. There's definitely a thing where that yes, all the corporate people in the setting are wealthy and doing really well, but there definitely is a thing about how the rest of the society is pretty poor and really living, just getting by, scraping to survive. Really, I mean, survival is one of the key. Really, that is the point of the Cyberpunk game, is that you just need to survive this twisted reality. But I do think that it's interesting about the wealth at the top, but then at the bottom there's people living in extreme poverty, which we're seeing it in our televisions all the time. Food banks in America as well now. So the biggest economy in the world, and they can't afford to feed their own people.
It's tent cities and these sort of things, and a lot of major metropolitan cities in America, as well as all over. In fairness, a lot of capital cities like that. I think the backlash to automation has yet to be realised as much as it possibly will to come. I think that's my if I'm doing any Nostradamus type predictions here. I think that will be once the war on drugs and the COVID and all that kind of stuff settles down. I think the next big thing will be loss of work to automation, and certainly my line of work is that's what I kind of do. I'm maybe the bad guy.
You're always a bad guy.
I hate to admit it, yeah, but I think my biggest villainy is yet to be realised is when I basically So automation's a massive part of what I do is trying to basically put people out of jobs, which isn't great, but better to be part of the solution than the problem, I guess. I don't know. Remains to be seen. Yes, exactly. As I stroke my cat here. But yeah, it's coming. I think, and I think the backlash from that could be as bad as anything we've seen so far with protests and what we're seeing the likes of in Portland at the moment about police and racism and the kind of, to a lesser extent, the freedom marches against wearing masks for COVID, that kind of thing. I think the protests to be seen after mass unemployment through automation from the corporations could trump all that, perhaps.
Certainly, that's another strong element in Cyberpunk, is kind of sticking it to the man, as it were, and being against the system, trying to bring down the system. That's there's definitely a strong anti-authoritarian theme to Cyberpunk. So I think we'll just kind of try and tie up here, because I think we've went on a bit. So just getting back quickly to technology, you can also get cyber limbs, which is you can literally have a limb shot off in the game, and you can have a brand new one grafted onto you.
Know about that one.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot you had a mishap with a submachine gun that took your foot off or something, was it?
It was, yeah. I think again, it's something we can talk about a bit more. But from memory, you have to. There's a kind of gameplay element to see how good a cybernetic you get. Is that right? It's not simply it's to do with what you can afford and how good a doctor you can find and all that kind of stuff. So you can either get some really cool kind of enhancement, which actually is better than your original leg, or you can just get like a cyber peg. I think is the other equivalent.
I think you get that, yeah, but there is also an element of chance as to how much humanity you lose.
Yeah, that's the main downside of all this, of the technology, is that the more of this stuff, I don't think there's so much what you're suggesting, Craig. I don't think it can go wrong as such. It's more that how much humanity you lose every time you're doing something that's
I think
adding technology. It reduces your humanity until the point when you end up as a cyber psycho, which is when you just go on a kill crazy rampage and you become an NPC and there's a new roll up on your character. So
I think the bit it's talking about is mainly governed by money, like because you can accumulate like credits in the game. So how good of a thing you want to buy is. Like...
Yeah, I think you're right. I think now thinking back to it, it was basically I couldn't afford a great one or a great doctor, so it was one of those ones that you'd be healing for weeks as well. And
it's one from a GM's point of view that you don't want to give the players too much cash at the start because they just go crazy and you just end up with a bunch of tanks in the game, and you want them taking a finesse and pick carefully the things that they want and not go overboard.
So my advice to anyone considering playing the game, I guess, would be to, if you're going to jump on top of a truck and fire a submachine gun whilst riding a truck, maybe wait until a few weeks in until you've got a bit of a savings account sorted.
Yeah, the machine guns are definitely difficult. It was to do with fumbling, and we can maybe talk about some of that in the mechanics in a future podcast. The other thing I never mentioned was that you can get chips, which you can learn skills by just plugging a chip in, and so you get that thing in the Matrix where it happens. It's the kind of famous scene where Neo says, "I know kung fu." That's literally what happens with these chip things that you can plant in your head. You learn a new skill, which is a cool idea, and I really liked it when it happened in the Matrix because I was familiar with this idea and I thought, yeah, that's really good. That's like the Cyberpunk game. So there was that, and obviously there's I'm not going to talk about it in this podcast. We can talk about Netrunners in a future one. But yeah, you can have reality happening in different levels, the same as in the Matrix film, where you get the reality, and then you can also set the game in the virtual reality. I think you've got to really have a team all of Netrunners to do that if you want to go into those different levels. Because the way the game's set up, it's not really that satisfying. The Netrunner player essentially goes off and does a sub game while he hacks into the corporate machine, and so is a GM. And I think for players as well, it's not particularly helpful. It's splitting the party immediately, but as I say, it's like a sub game within the game, and there's much effort and there's thought, and I think it's all good ideas. In a practical sense, the Netrunner side of the game doesn't really work unless you're all Netrunners or you're not. And we played it more as we weren't Netrunners, and you could hire a Netrunner who would go and do all that stuff, so that we could focus on the action and the reality, if you like. But it's definitely an interesting thing that you could play a game like that you could have it coming in and out of virtual reality and have those two realities, and you could have multiple virtual realities, I suppose, built upon each other, and get into like an Inception type scenario where you're dealing in different settings. So you've got all these kind of possibilities, which is a great thing about the Cyberpunk game. Gives you lots of possibilities for all sorts of different storytelling. But one thing I would always have in Cyberpunk, and I don't know if you would agree with this, would be ultra violence, because the combat system is really lethal anyway. But I've always thought it should be like a a John Woo film or a Paul Verhoeven film, RoboCop or Total Recall or Starship Troopers, where it's, everything's blown, just insanely violent. And maybe it's just maybe it's something about sci-fi geeks, but yeah, that's something I've always liked. A lot of the kind of films and comics and books that I've read, I've always liked when they're kind of over the top with the violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I agree with you on that one.
It's probably something we miss a wee bit with Star Wars. Certainly, I do, because Star Wars is just blasters. Yeah, you shoot them and that's it. But yeah, you lose the gore factor.
I think that was one of the things flipping between playing Star Wars and Cyberpunk was a lot of times we had to remind ourselves that to do things a wee bit more Star Wars and not always take headshots, or if you get a critical success in Star Wars, you describe what you did, and a lot of the time would be, shooting them in the head with their laser pistol and his head explodes in fragments. You go, it's not very Star Wars, though, is it?
It's definitely very Cyberpunk, though, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
So, anyway, yeah, I think. Probably the other things just to kind of wrap up would be to mention that the rulebook gives kind of key tenets or things that you should be doing in Cyberpunk. Style over substance is the first of those, and basically means that you should always look cool when you're doing anything. You should always be wearing mirror shades, and you should always be delivering one-liners and so on, like you just walked out an Arnold Schwarzenegger film from the 80s. There's also attitude is everything, so you should be ramping up your personality, and so if you're a solo that's you should have an intimidating presence, and you walk in like you own the room, and really go to extremes with it. I suppose Johnny Mnemonic would be a good example of that, where the kind of characters were all a bit like...
Yeah, they were a bit cartoon, weren't they? Or a wee bit kind of over the top.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think that's one of the things, one of the elements of the game that maybe I didn't struggle with, but I think as a player, you're trying to maybe optimize your character a wee bit, but at the same time, you also want to try and indulge in a lot of these things that maybe aren't the best path for your character in terms of survivability or whatever. But I guess that's the role playing element of it coming in there, not the pure mechanics driven gameplay.
Yeah, although the last, one of the last two things, one of them that comes into that, which is always take it to the edge. It says you shouldn't hold back. You should be risking everything in a game, which is hard when the rules are particularly brutal. Because I think when you know that the combat is so deadly, you're probably more minded towards hiding behind cover, and taking pot shots.
Yeah.
But
it's a funny one to offer as well, because because of the character creation, which I think is something we'll talk about in another episode. But the amount of involvement in creating a character and doing the backstory compared to some other RPG systems, you don't necessarily want to just walk in the first room and get shot to pieces.
Yeah, that's true.
The amount of time investment,
No, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's designed in a way that promotes you to get augmented and experience that part of the game, because it had a built-in aspect where you're potentially going to lose like an arm or a leg or whatever.
It's just a bit of a curve to get to that stage of actually being able to afford these things without risking, taking massive risks for big payoffs as well.
Yeah, I think that's why they kind of include I'm pretty sure there was some pretty budget replacement limb. So in theory you could end up in a bad position essentially, which I suppose might motivate you to go along with some of this corporate greed, which is a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last thing which would make GMs tear their hair out all over the world is it says to break the rules, which is a horrendous idea for a GM to encourage their players to do. But Yeah, break every rules within the world. Just don't break the game rules, because the GM will have you for that.
Yeah.
But anyway,
So it's something interesting. Actually, I don't maybe not done my research here, but I'm just trying to think of other. Are there other Cyberpunk RPG systems out there other than Cyberpunk 2020? I'm guessing there is.
I'm pretty sure there is.
I'd be interested to see how they compare. Again, it's not one for now, but yeah, I'm just interested how they compare and how they deal with things like the party being split between realities, etc.
I believe there was a version of Cyberpunk for the GURPS system, and wasn't there? Or what was that? There was a computer game that was something Shadow. I can't think.
Oh, Shadowrun, yeah.
Shadowrun, yeah. There's an RPG of that, but I don't really have any experience, so I don't. I don't want to digress in those ones because I don't really have anything to offer.
It'd just be interesting for a wee bit of a different way of looking at it. Because I think that's one of the things. Mechanically, I think there's things in Cyberpunk 2020 that could be improved upon, but there's also bits that are brilliant. So
I think as well that Judge Dredd, which I play as well, definitely has a lot of cyberpunk elements in it. There's the sheer scale of the city, and there's there are perps that do have kind of cybernetic arms and things like that. It's not as grim. It's not really doesn't quite fit into. Well, Dread is grim in lots of different ways, but it's got a lot more insanity and a lot more kind of satire and humour. Yeah. And for a start, they've got weather control, which means it's always sunny. It's always sunny in Dread, so that's that doesn't fit right with Cyberpunk for me. But anyway, yeah, hopefully that's given you some insight if you're listening, if you still are, to the world of Cyberpunk. And yeah, the next few podcasts that we'll be doing, we'll talk more about the rules and experiences of playing Cyberpunk, and we'll be getting into some of the GM side of things and how you should go about creating a Cyberpunk world, and some of the tropes we think you should and the elements you should be using in those. Thanks Craig and Bob for joining me for the chat, and
cheers.
Hope you enjoyed it as well, and we'll speak to you all soon. Thanks very much then. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.